Well, hello, people. Another week of The Secret of Light by Walter Russell. This is the Secret of Light discussion group, and we will be covering Chapter 14, Motion Simulating Rest, and Chapter 15, The Illusion of Change. Quite a bit in these chapters, kind of reminds me a lot of Alice in Wonderland with time and space and illusion. And anybody else who read the chapters or material have anything that they want to talk about before we get started? How it resonated with them or anything?
Where are we? 14?
14 and 15. All right. Well, let's go ahead and go with the first question.
Will, can
Yes?
I just ask though, because I'm looking at my book and is this is in part 1 and there's the same chapter numbers for part 2, is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Got
part 1 is, I think, omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotent. And they all have different chapters. All right.
I'm a little out of sync, but otherwise caught up.
Okay, so what we do, again, just to remind you, is that I take kind of one of Walter's statements out of the book and turn it into a question. And then I put the page number and the answer there, and then we discuss and have some slides about, what do we think about that and how does that relate to our lives today? So for number 1, can motion ever become rest? And from page 75, he says, no, motion can cease, but it can never become rest. Motion in violent motion simulates rest and balance through violent motion. Examples are the planets spinning, clouds appear still, and spinning spoke wheels appear solid. So I have some pictures of these so we can kind of get, so as he's saying here, see, this is actually a spoked rim, but as it spins, it becomes solid. And as it becomes solid, as that appearance becomes solid, it looks like it's still, but it's actually spinning fast. So the faster and the more violent the motion, the more solid this would become and the more still it would look. So that's what he's kind of saying about a spinning wheel. He also talks, and again, I'll have to apologize to flat earthers, about a sphere that we're on, the Earth, and it's spinning at a very fast speed, especially at the equator. And if we're on it, we don't notice that it's spinning. As we look around, we don't see that things are spinning. Everything looks at rest or still, but it is actually spinning very quickly.
It seems to me, I don't mean to interrupt, but everything that Russell talks about is based on this equator and magnetic fields thing. It has to be for his thing to work. It's got to be round.
Exactly. Everything he talks about is, and that's why he talks about that through the magnetic field. Actually, you end up with a curvature naturally just from the way the magnetic fields work as they dissipate in the center.
But the 4 fields that he talked about, I remember I posted that. It was very confusing. I'm still a little confused, but it sounds like in and out. He says you need like going forward and then going back is 2 separate things.
Yes, exactly. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So the other thing he talked about was clouds appear to float slowly by, but are actually traveling extremely fast, especially if they're traveling, at the same direction the Earth is spinning, then it would have to be going very fast in order for us to even see, or for them to even move in relativity to our position. And then he also shows the orbiting galaxies in constant motion here. And this actually looks like one of his diagrams of the spinning causal universe with the. So that's what he's trying to say. And even as we look at each other, as we look at our hands, we see them as solid and as still, but they're made up of molecules that are spinning very quickly with electrons and protons, or however you want to view the atom. But there are particles that are moving very fast in anything we look at. So a wall, whatever we look at, it's actually made up of very, very dynamic particles that are spinning and moving.
But we're moving and spinning with it.
Exactly. But we look like we're still. So that's kind of like motion simulating rest. But what he says is that motion can stop, but it can never be rest. Any comments on that?
So some of these examples are things that we can kind of perceive at our macro scale. Would you think of this as something, another example of the as above, so below principle, where
Correct.
we can see these things at our scale, but then then we can extrapolate down to the kind of very micro, and it's the same thing.
Yes, and that's really what Russell is trying to lead us to, is to actually change our perspective. We become very fixed on what we see, and what he's saying, don't be fooled by what you see. Always realize that that what we see is just a picture show. It's just a cinema.
Thank you.
And that what is really going on. And then I don't want to. That's more to the end of the chapter. But once we get into that state of mind, a lot of things will change for our knowing.
The cinema statement was exactly what I wanted to hear you say. It's an illusion. It's really also, you could say.
Yep. And
We're in a
number
video.
two, according to Russell, is
Yes.
emotion one senses in the mind real? And from page 76, no, it has no more reality than the one senses in a motion picture. So as we go back and we kind of, look at, how animation is done, right? Each of these pictures show a different scene, but the picture doesn't, there's no movement in the picture itself, right? If we flip these and add sequence to them, then we perceive motion. So this is kind of how our mind works. We pick up these images, our senses pick up these images, and then because time moves forward, we perceive motion, but there really is no motion. It's just a bunch of stills that we are putting together in a sequence of time in our mind.
But there's no time either. So
yeah, but we time is not real, but we have sequence. In order for us to understand, then we have to put it into a sequential thing for us to have our understanding. So that we're sensing motion, but there truly is no motion.
I suppose it's something that we'll get into later when we get into some of the diagrams and visualizations of his concepts. But one of the questions that I've had in hearing all this is, down at these sequence steps, what is the process by which one of our fundamental, well, I'm not sure if I can say atoms, but pieces of matter translates itself from one position to the next? Is it a discrete step? If it's like this video analog where you actually have stepped sequences that our perceptions kind of blur into a continuity, is it the same for our low-level representations of matter?
Yes, and let's take on the next question, and maybe we can discuss that or get a better concept of it. So in the Divine Iliad, what is required for the play of creation to exist? The changing universe of God's imagining and thinking allows the actors and the play to manifest, even though there is no change in God. So what we're going to talk about coming up is how the senses will record what we see in our electric mind. And through that electric mind, we cast forth the matter and create it.
Right.
So if once we get into knowing and stillness, we don't cast the shadows or the images or the matter that comes from the changing universe, and we begin to have God's imagining and thinking, and so there is no change in God. So if what you're asking me is it manifest sequentially, or is it manifest holy. Is that what you're asking, Jeremy?
I think what I'm really trying to do is just to grapple with the gap between the stillness of the unchanging source
Well, and
over into this perceived motion,
Animation.
right?
Wait, how about the cards? Have you ever done the thing where you take the cards and you
Mhm.
flick them?
yeah, that's what that thing I showed before was, just all those cards in one
Mhm.
big
Right,
big
but doing it is, I
Yeah.
mean, I think for me, you know,
And I think, what it is for me is that God's mind is so vast and so unknowable. Even some of the mystics in early times said, don't even worry about that. Don't try to figure it all out, right? Because to try to figure it out, it's just it's going to be a mind game that's going to confuse you.
Mhm.
And in order for us to actually understand God's mind, we can't envision it all at one time, even though that's the way it is, that the knowing is just one vastness of everything, eternal everything. And our minds and our knowing as humans can't grab that.
Yeah.
So so what we've had is that when we had the divine fall, which is really falling into consciousness from a spiritual nature, before we fell into physical matter, we did things supposedly just because we knew it. We didn't think about it. It was just something that we knew. We didn't know why. We just kind of felt that that's what we're supposed to do, because the consciousness of God told us all things, and we could understand pretty much all things. But there was still a vibration or a sense from the one of what to do. Once we fell into matter and we actually created the mind and created our eyes and created a lot of these other things in which we see, we then had to break up that message so we could also manifest physical into bits and pieces that then we brought into our being to a red blue shift and into a creation in order for us to understand the one mind. So even though all information is of one purpose and one omniscience, in order for humans to understand that and manifest, they have to break it down. Just as when I put this into as we talked here with the magnetic light coming into the human and then turning into the light spectrum and then going out. This is how we understand and view the world. In the knowing, we don't have the capacity to understand all knowing. It would just, our minds would blow up. We would just be, it's almost like where in the Bible, it says you can't see God, you burn up and die. And it's really to understand the entirety of God would just be so much for a human mind that he either go insane or probably just short circuit. There's too much information. And so we've been allowed the processes in order to take this in and begin to be aware of this physical creation. But the key is that we know that. For those that don't know that, their whole view of reality and of the physical is much different. Once you become a spiritual being and you begin to see this creation and you begin to understand how it works, then you can actually become much more creative and actually seek the knowing and then partner with it to create what the knowing wants done versus just trying to create out of the thinking mind, which is what we're doing today in materialism.
we're not creating matter out of it, though. We don't realize.
Well, we're creating computers and different things. I mean, and we're creating atom bombs and a lot of things, right?
And like I just meant simultaneously, like pop create.
No, well, again, I don't know. I mean, there some, it's kind of like when we talked about hypnagogia, right? And Edison, how he would, start to fall asleep, and when is it actually created? Is it created when it actually manifests, and I can hold it in my hand? Or is it actually created when I have the thought and understand how to do it?
I got you. That's
right?
That's thought of it before.
Right. So it really comes about when is creation, when is conception type of thing, right? Is it when the baby comes out, or is it when the baby actually, says, here's the spark of life, right? So that is, where Russell's trying to go and trying to understand that, in what we would call our fallen state, it's not due to sin, but it's due because we fell from one consciousness into a more dense consciousness of Earth in order to accomplish a different mission. How do we translate that into the matter that is produced? As I said, we can create beautiful things, exquisite things from the knowing, or we can create things that are deadly and harmful. Does that answer your question better, Jeremy, or am I still running around it?
Well, I wouldn't say it answered it in Now I Know, but it's really nice to just listen to that and sit on it. And there are aspects that make sense, and then there's other things that raise questions. Yeah, it was very nice.
And again, I don't have all knowing, right? I'm in the same path you guys are. So
I got an observation.
Yes.
So he says, don't trust what you see.
Yes, he says, don't trust what you see. It's an illusion.
So is the corollary then, don't trust science?
Well, I would say that, again, trusting is discernment. And so what I think he's trying to have us understand is discernment.
Okay.
So once we understand knowing and thinking and sensing, that will allow us to have greater discernment in the physical world.
Okay.
So, so you say trust, it's an illusion, understand it's an illusion. But as you look at it also, have discernment as to how was it created, why was it created, and has it come from the knowing? Or is it coming straightly from a sense of, scientific materialism? Because there is, Walter Russell was a scientist. He did create things in science. And even Steiner, warns against being a pure mystic.
All right.
Within anthroposophy, the definition of anthroposophy was scientific. Was it spiritual science? It was called spiritual science.
Spiritual science, yeah.
Emerged like syncretism.
Exactly. So I think that's what Russell's trying to get us to.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
It's another kind of rebalancing of these two poles.
Correct. And
science like the scientists, or science the thing? Science.
I think of science as like the method. It's like empiricism and observation and experimentation and learning, and not necessarily just seeing with eyes, but kind of seeing with all of the senses, and to kind of to divine, to use that word kind of intentionally, an understanding of things and knowing. But yeah, the materialist science is something else that's kind of gone off the rails.
And I think the key word that you just said, Jeremy, was the understanding. As I said, from what I've read about the times before we fell into materialism and before the time our consciousness became we didn't understand why we did anything. Angels don't understand why. They just kind of have this knowing in them that says this is what you're supposed to do. So they kind of get kind of the instruction, and that's just what they do. And so when they look at us, they kind of think, well, why would you do anything different?
Well,
don't you just know what to do?
We are the angels, though.
Well, we are angels that are physical, and once we fall into matter, it changes our perception and changes our consciousness.
One thing that is interesting, maybe you'll have a perspective on this, in that idea of how we've fallen into a physical form, is that there's something in pure physicality that still feels very connected to that. Like when you run, or when a top athlete, or even anybody is doing something without thinking, using their body, I feel like they're tapping into that. Like, I've been trying to feel that a lot when I'm, these days, and reflecting on that when I'm outside and active, how like the press of the ankle is not something that I'm thinking about or planning, and it's just so magically intuitive, or any kind of movement that you're doing. And so it's interesting, like it's like our heads have gotten lost, but our bodies, the physical form, is still actually connected to that.
When you're focused on something, when you focus strongly doing it, you aren't, that is this God doing it together with us. When you're focused and like gone into it, like the sports things you just said.
And that's what, like Michael Jordan, like some of the greatest basketball players would talk about, in the zone, right? You get in the zone.
Yep.
And, I've never been a great basketball player, but I have played basketball. And it's kind of like when you're playing the game, you can try to steer the game. You can try to, and this is kind of what they say is the difference between LeBron and Jordan, is that LeBron tries to command the game to where Jordan let the game come to him. Mm-hmm. So as he was in the flow and let the game come, he was much more. And when you watch the two play, both are great athletes. LeBron, is probably one of the best physical specimens of an athlete I've ever seen. But Jordan just had so much more grace and beauty to his game because he was in the flow, he let it come. And I will say that, like when you play golf, if you try to think too much, golf is probably one of the games I think that's the hardest to be in your head. If you step out of your head and just get into the flow of the game becomes much easier, even though it's still difficult, but you're no longer getting in the way.
IT management's like that. I mean, for real. If you're focused on something, shit just works. You don't even know how to do it. Mm-hmm. In my experience, anyway.
Well, I think all life is.
Yes.
I think all, and that's what Russell is trying. And again, when it gets back to Brian's question about trusting science, I think again it's learning discernment and understanding, what is real and what isn't, and as we perceive that, what do we do with it, and how do we live according to that? And that's a tough shift in the mind because that's not what we're being taught today.
Now, I'm confused what science, though. I mean, in the sense of this, God is everything, whether it's science or, whatever it is.
To think God is everything, that's fine. But your understanding then is that God does everything. We don't know how God does it. So within science, we're beginning to understand how God does it. That's a little bit different. That's where science, spirituality is kind of based on a blind faith or, science is based on an understanding of how it works.
And he even wrote this. He even wrote that when he gave his book to the scientists of the world. But
Walter Russell,
correct. That God exists.
Yeah, that God exists, but we as men and as have the ability to understand how and why it exists.
Yeah, and I forgot though when you said it.
Yeah, and so that's the key really to me in science, is that we have the understanding. Because within the knowing, I can say, I know that God exists and I know that God does all things, but then God can download to us the specifics of how they're done and that's what this whole book is kind of about, is Walter Russell's concept of how these things are made manifest.
And that all the scientists of the world should get in on this instead of using that broken crap they're using.
Exactly. And that's why he's saying that what I know and what I use and the science that I understand is from God and is divine. And the science you use is just made up of electrical thinking, sensing, and is not true. It's what you think because it's what you sense, but it's not real. And that's why it is polluting, and that's why it does all these other things that are not beneficial to the world as a whole.
He's got a different chart of, what is it called? The elements, the chart
Correct.
Of elements.
Correct.
It's like 102, and a lot of it's about, I think, is it hydrogen? That's really more octaves that they don't count or something.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end of this.
Yeah, I'm thinking the wrong book. Sorry.
You're thinking of the universe.
Yeah, that's what I've been reading. It's really taken over, in my head.
So any more about the change in universe, and we're going to move on to chapter 15. Any more comments before we move on to 15? Okay. So chapter 15 goes back to the illusion of change, Stick Song, the grand illusion, if anybody remembers that. According to Russell, is there change in the conscious universe of knowing? And on page 78, no. There is only an illusion of change, set up by the two interchanging lights of thinking to divide the one whole idea into many separate ideas and record them in moving matter. So, Jeremy, this is kind of back to your question, of how does it work, I think, and how does it, and as we talked, before, we still talk about coming out, going into the blue and red, and then going into matter, and it's almost as if we are viewing, this is a picture of like a shadow theater in the Japanese culture, where behind this there's images that have a light behind them, and they're being projected on a screen, and then the people on the outside are watching the screen, but there's nothing really there, on the screen. There is some, but we're just watching it happen, and it's not really real. But yet we can perceive it as being real when there's nothing really happening. It's just like solenoid film. Now I'm not saying that the things behind this aren't real, but the light that's projecting it on the screen, this is just a projection on a screen that everybody's watching and thinking is real. And with that, we talked about the blue and the red. I think this is what you were talking about, Doug, is that the two divided lights here, the red, which is male, and the blue, which is female. I think sometimes people get this mixed up, between the red being male and the blue being female, that these two together form the Trinity, as what we would talk about, the three into the creation. So then there is but the one cosmic substance of mind, and then this breaks into the different elements that we were just talking about. So any comments on that in terms of there is only an illusion of change set up by the two interchanging lights of thinking to divide the one whole idea into many separate ideas and record them. So the matter that we're seeing is just a recording that is fleeting. It records and then it moves on. And that's kind of the illusion, that it's not really solid. It is just a recording for us to understand at that moment in time.
So thinking is maybe like the manipulation of a prism that allows the splitting of the kind of consistent, solid one light into all of these multiple parts. And thinking is maybe like a collaborative effort by all thinking creatures to actually co-create that prism together.
Correct. Well, then the prism is kind of more of the instrument. So we can use light, or we can use the periodic table, or we can use sound. So the prism is really just, that's the tool of sight, right? To physically manifest would be the tool of the periodic elements, right? To create music would be the tonal scale. But each of these, and we're going to show that later also, each of these correspond to those different scales. And it really is just, how does our mind or our body consume that matter or that idea that flows from the one? So as you just explained, you have it come out, it turns into this, the blue shift, red shift. Now between here, and we've talked about this, I think, 2 weeks ago, there can be other things that influence the message coming from God in the spiritual realm. You can have other voices, You can have other beings, you can have other things that can influence this. Because out here is what you'd also call the collective unconscious, right? So within that collective unconscious, you have all beings, not just humans. You know, Jung kind of just said it was, you know, just the human existence that was the collective unconscious. But there's truly a collective unconscious that is manifested of all conscious beings out here that are actually, you know, can get into our signal. And that's why we have to filter our signal through our knowing. And the cleaner this antenna is, the cleaner will be the signal that we pass forth. The more dirty this is, the more, and when I say dirty, the more clogged up it is with sensing and thinking will create the outcome that is much different.
Are animals have
Yeah.
that same thing too? And
Well, looking at my cat these days, just wondering what's going on inside you.
well, plants and animals.
What some spiritual people say, and what Steiner said, is that they actually have what they call a group soul. They don't have an individual soul like people do. So I know some people believe that animals have individual consciousness, but they may not have individual souls. So when they go to the collective unconscious, which is really at the soul level, they would still function as a wolf would be a part of a canine collective unconscious. And the same thing with plants. When people talk about plants, they often say that plants, whether I talk to, you know, one redwood tree or 7, they all have the same personality in a sense because they all go into that redwood tree conscious. But they would still be functioning out here. So all that we do, because this out between this area here is where the plants would sense us, would sense our feelings and our emotions, which we put out into the manifestation in the emotional planes.
Considering it's an illusion, it is possible that you know, they just have more, but they don't look like that. Like a tree might actually be, you know, what another person.
Mm-hmm. And they and again, it is. Don't forget that we are the tree, and the tree is us, right? I mean, we are all things, and all things are us. That's Walter Russell's. You know, that's where he's saying we got to shift our consciousness. We got to, you know, we've got to really understand what is real and the difference between the two, and that it's an illusion because it really is just a manifestation of us and how we interact within this plane to manifest what we're seeing, feeling, and touching. So then it says, what role, any more on that, on question 1 of chapter 15, about the one whole idea into many separate ideas and recording them in matter, before we move on? All right, let's go ahead to question 2. What role in the divine cinema do the senses play? So from page 78, they are the audience. They are electric and belong to the thought universe of motion and do not respond to stillness. So again, we're talking about what role do the senses play. So what I did was, here on this one, I just threw in a bunch of shots, right, of audiences. And these are the senses, right? And so what they're doing is they're responding to what they see or encounter. And it's pretty easy to tell, right, what's going on in the screen, even though you can't see it.
Except for the last image.
Well, this one here.
Oh yeah, well, I guess, you know, they're all seeing something that's at an angle.
Or that they feel they're moving, right? That they feel they're actually like, this might be like, say, I don't know if you guys ever been like in Flyover America at Disneyland or something like that, where you're actually seeing a screen and it's you know, turning and weaving. You're doing the same thing, right? Because you think you're moving.
Yes.
And that's why I kind of put this in here, was because we even sense motion from what we see, even though there is no motion.
That's a scary part of what's coming.
Mm-hmm. And you look at this one, right? You see this guy right here, right? He's just mesmerized, right? He's just laying back, and this guy is, we talked about the trance state with Mesmer and those, a few weeks ago. You put on these glasses, you get in the trance state pretty quick, right? Because you lose all sense of everything around you. And this is where a lot of gaming and things is going now into the virtual reality realm. And once we get into that realm, we really lose all function of our knowing mind because we are so engrossed, just like this kid right here. I mean, this guy is just tell me what to do and I'll do it. So these are the senses. So as you think about the senses, they're just, they are just reacting to what they see or feel or touch or smell. They're just the audience. But those are recorded in us, and then we take this illusion. So it'd be like, like say that you see a picture of your wife or someone who looks like your wife on the screen, and she's, having an affair with this other man, and that becomes real to you, right? Because you've seen it on the screen, and it's really what you're making in your mind. You come home, hey, honey, what are you doing? And it's like, what are you talking about? Well, you had an affair. No. Well, but you've created one because of your senses, right? Your senses have sensed that, but it was never real. So as we get into, that's what Walter Russell's saying here, is that our senses are really just the audience watching. And from that, they are recording those sensations. And from those recorded sensations, we develop a reality that may not be a reality that is real, that actually happened, or well, anything we see is what he's saying is not happening. But so these are what he's saying what the senses are. They're just the audience in a play or in a movie. Any comments on that? Because the second half of this is that they do not respond to stillness. So it's kind of like when you meditate and you sit still and you don't have the feeling of motion. Your mind is not creating images from sensing. When you're still, you're trying to create the images in your mind of knowing. So that's why meditation really helps, because we are in this stillness. Turn off the lights, sit with yourself, become still, and know that I am God, right? That's from the Bible, right? Know that stillness. Because the electric do not respond to stillness. So we're in stillness, we're quieting the mind, we're cutting off that monkey mind, as they call it, that chattering that's going on all the time. And we are beginning to get into the knowing mind. Any comments on what I just said? Okay, we'll go on to question 3. Do the senses have knowledge of what they sense? No, they merely record motion. So do the senses have knowledge of what they sense? And Walter Russell from page 78 says no, they merely record motion. So, I kind of put these, I didn't really know how to show any of this, but maybe this will kind of look. So, here's kind of like the idea of the mind, and it's kind of spiraling into and beginning to record on a disc or on an LP album, right? And as it records, you can kind of look at like the structure of a hard disk, and you have a tract, right, which maybe just, that goes all the way around. And then you might have a sector that might be about one specific, and then you have a cluster, right? And then you have a sector of a tract. So this is how your mind may record, this, the senses. In the same way that because as they say, there's nothing new created, and that all technology actually is just a mimicry of the natural. So this may be how our brain actually, like this could be the story that we tell ourselves all the time about who we are and what our life is, right? And that goes all throughout us every day, doesn't change, and we keep relating to that. And this cluster may be a portion of our life, right? That we did experience that. It could actually be that it could be that we experience something different, but this is still dominant because it's going to continue on once we go into the next track. And then these would be smaller portions, but that fill this whole time space within that. So as it goes around, see, as our electric mind would go around, it would only pick up this right here when it was on this track for that distance. This one, the sector, it will pick up all the time as it goes around. And once you get into this track, this is probably more like, this could be, I guess this would be more of the story of your life because it keeps hitting it. And this would be once you get into like your subconscious state and you're just doing your daily routine that you've done every day without getting out of this, and you just stay in this track. So we're recording everything we see and do in matter, and then this becomes us. When Russell says, no, this hard drive is not you. You know, you're here in the center. You're here in the knowing. So you got to get off the disk and get in the center and begin to understand the knowing.
The disk, though, is different than the other one. The other one's a vortex.
Yes. Well, again, what I'm saying is this is how what we do to record onto the disk. We're taking in from the senses.
Oh yeah, no, I understand.
And
it doesn't seem like they're the same though, since the other one is a vortex, and that would not work with what he's, in the hard drive structure example. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Well, again, I just put these up here to kind of show that we're taking in information from the outside and recording it on the disk. So this is kind of,
I got it. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough to find, images that explain what he's talking about.
As soon as you said it, I got it.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
So does anyone have any comments on question 3 about that they merely record motion, that the senses merely record motion?
What do they actually record into?
They record into the brain, they record, as we I think talked about in chapter 2, that they actually record onto the brain.
No, it moved up. It's the cloud now.
Well, that's the AI. That's the AI brain. But they record, and I think this is the difference between what we would call the Akasha and the mind. Because all things that happen actually record in the Akasha also, right? That's how people read the Akashic records. But those are what the Akashic record stores is only that of the divine. When you begin, but what's happened now is that the internet has now been created as a false Akashic record for those things that are not of knowing but are of sensing. So it's almost like the internet is becoming as I say, when I say Akashic intelligence, the original AI versus, artificial intelligence, which is this attempt to create an Akashic record, but it is not based on divine knowing, it is based on electric thinking. Any comments on that? Jeremy, did I answer your question at all, or?
Yeah, I mean,
as good as I can, huh?
Yeah, no, it's just things to kind of sit on and absorb.
Well, and again, we're only that's what That's why we're not at the end of the book yet, right? We're just kind of learning all these things, and hopefully by the end, they're all going to come together. But a lot of this is just
For the
repeating.
40 books.
Yeah, a lot of this is we're just repeating some of the things that we learned in the first chapters. And then it's getting deeper, and we're just kind of digging deeper and deeper in.
Right.
So number 4, in how many directions do the senses respond? So in page 78, one direction. They sense the forward flow of time, but not the backward. So they sense the forward flow. And
I thought time was not even real, that it was an illusion. So
it is.
How do you reconcile that?
Well, the way you reconcile it is that it's talking about what's the question asking? Is it asking about time? The question says, in how many directions do the senses respond?
Respond. Okay, right.
The senses. They sense the forward flow of time, but not backwards. So time is two-directional, right? If you can have a forward, you can have a back. I mean, it's multidimensional actually, but what happens is, because our mind records what happens sequentially ahead of us. So say that we see Uncle Joe and we have an encounter with Uncle Joe, and he yells at us and we yell back, and then we spit on him. We've recorded all that in our mind. Well, if we could take the senses back, we could say, oh, I want to rewind that, right? I want to rewind that. And when Uncle Joe says something mean to me, I want to do this. And therefore that changes my, what I'm going to record. But we can't do that. Right? That recording's made, and that reference back is always going to be the same. And we will look at that reference back, usually with despair, but we can actually, look forward and say, well, next time he does this, I'm going to do this in a bet, and so we can look forward to with fear that's going to happen again, or anticipation. So we can never really live in that moment, because once we live in the moment, we're in stillness, all knowing, but we can only travel in the one direction. So we as humans are constantly traveling in one direction. Now there has been some discussion on some of the things I listened to. I think I talked about it with G.G. Young and other things, that beings now, some advanced beings, and even maybe us now, we're just not made aware of it, that we can actually travel forward and backwards in time. That some of the beings that are seen as ETs, or what they call the Greys, the big-headed things with big eyes and 3 fingers and no body, are actually future versions of ourselves that are traveling back in time. Now that could be, but they're actually not going back in time sequentially. They're actually using other methods to phase shift or do other things to get in time. We still do not have the ability to actually view time in the reverse. It doesn't mean that we can't go to that there may be individuals or beings that can go back in time, but they don't view their lives that way. They know they're going back in time, and they're just doing that. So as you see, here's the wave. So we're only traveling in one direction, right? On these waves. I pulled this up for you, Doug, because you were actually asking about the sun and the black hole. Yep. And from this, it kind of showed, these black holes.
That's in the book, that picture.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah. And yes, thank you.
And it reminded me very much of the yin yang, where within these, you actually had some of these other aspects of that dot on both sides.
And the current astrologers, and the current belief in everything is that there's these black holes that just suck everything up that comes near it. And, that's it. They don't mention any balance, that they don't just suck anything up. Like every sun, there's a black hole that goes with it.
Yes, for every light, there is a darkness. And that's
what it explains it really well in that other frame.
And so the one thing I did want to show here was, some people don't really get that red shift, blue shift. So within each portion of the wave, and this is what we talked a little bit about last time was, where is the wave shift? And what's funny is we talked about the wave being, from here to here. And the reason for that is the extent of the red-blue shift.
Yeah, right.
Is within this portion of the wave. So once we get past this point, this apex or crest that we talked about, then we go back into a blue shift. So that's probably why Russell was defining this as the length of the wave, even though within yin and yang it goes all the way, but that's really 2 cycles of the wave, not just the single cycle of the wave. And within this, I don't know if you guys can see this, but within this portion of the wave are the elements, right? Are the gases, and within here are the elements, right? And then here's even more. So these shifts and red shift, blue shift is how we, if you go back to the drawing in the beginning that we talked about that I created, this red shift, blue shift that's occurring right here is the portion of the wave that we then take and begin to make into the multi-dimensional to manifest in matter. So anybody?
I think your theory is a little bit flawed just because it doesn't account for like missing time.
Which theory?
Oh, you're talking about
We're getting feedback.
Echo.
oh shit. Is that better?
Yeah, it's much better. Thank you, Grant, for joining us.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead with the theory. Which theory was I talking about?
Oh, you're talking about time only being forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, Walter Russell's saying that. I'm not. I didn't say time was only forward. Again, we're not. This question's not asking about time. It's actually how many directions do the senses respond. So this one direction is saying that that's how the senses respond, not that there are more than one direction to time. I would agree that there's more directions to time because we know that there's a wave and it functions in both directions. It's just that our senses only respond in the one direction.
What is missing time?
Well, like think about when, like, for example, like when you're deep in an artful movement and like you can look up at the clock and the second hand takes for hour. It feels like an hour, but it's really a second.
Mm-hmm.
So like, yeah, I guess that's kind of what I mean.
And that I would say would be the stillness that the senses aren't picking up on. Because like you said, when you're engrossed and you're actually kind of dealing with source directly, and it's not the thinking mind so much, then you don't sense time. But even in that, you cannot travel backwards in time physically. Your senses can't travel backwards in time. They can only move forward. And I'm not saying that it's impossible for God to say, okay, now we're going to allow everybody to have their sensing go backwards too. But if that was to happen, I mean, that would probably cause a lot of chaos in our world, and in the person themselves, because they might get stuck and couldn't move forward. And I think that God wants us to constantly be moving forward within the universe. So I wasn't saying that time only moves in one direction, that we only sense it in one direction. Does that make more sense to you, Grant?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Do you have any more comments on how many directions do the senses respond?
Well, have you ever experienced like timelessness?
Yes, but again, to me, that's stillness. We're not traveling backwards, right? So it's kind of like I said, when I'm in meditation and in stillness and knowing, it's almost a timelessness. But I've also like experienced, like when I've ran long distances, like in races, like 10Ks or marathons, right? I've ran like a 10K and when I was younger in about 45 minutes, right? And I got done, and I thought it was 4 in the afternoon, and it was like, 8:45 to the race started. But during that time I was running, I was so intense that it seemed like it was forever. Each moment seemed like forever. You know, and when I got done, I thought I'd been 6 hours, and it had only been 45 minutes. So I've seen it kind of in both directions.
What do people mean when they refer to like the timeline? I guess like when you're studying like Akashic, this might be changing the subject, so you don't have to answer it. But when like Akashic records, they say, oh, on this timeline, this is kind of what happened.
Well, it's kind of like I would say that when you go into, and this is what, Steiner gets into, and if you go to Gigi Young, she'll talk about it quite a bit also. But there's within the Akashic record, there's a certain timeline, that may start with man, and it may start with Lemuria, and then go to Atlantis, and then go to the destruction of Atlantis, and then go to the Great Migration of the Atlanteans throughout the world and the periods, and then you have the growth of all the different civilizations and so on and so forth. So within that, that's kind of the timeline that's accepted by mystics as the timeline of man and the earth, right? Because you have to realize that all timelines that we have are in relation to the earth. Now, all planets and all galaxies and everything else may have separate and distinct timelines. Now, if you again get these are big questions about time, and if
that's okay. We don't have to go into that, but like what
Yeah.
I'm confused about is like when he says like motion, or he said something in the chapter about motion being an illusion, but I kind of see like time as just motion. That's
well, and time's an illusion. I mean, time has been, again, it's all these experiences, or I'd call them measurements, right, or metrics, have been put in place so that as the knowing of God, this all encompassing so much that we could not take it at one time if we actually did understand, if that's the way that God speaks. He's provided these different metrics, or whatever we want to call them, in order for us to break things down into pieces and give them some type of relevance and relativity, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that later here, so that we can understand these pieces and parts. So there is only an illusion of change set up by the two interchanging lights of thinking. I'm reading the answer to question 1. To divide the one whole idea into many separate ideas. So the idea of time, the idea of motion, the idea of all these things are put, in our consciousness and awareness to help us understand, because without those, like I said, our density in matter, we cannot, as humans, fathom that. And so we'd have to almost become spiritual beings again, or, ascend like Jesus, maybe. But even then, even Jesus said, I know a lot, but only the Father knows some things. There's things that I can't comprehend either. They're outside of my comprehension. And so these ideas, and this is what Russell wants us to begin to understand, is that the idea of the one is the real. Everything else is pieces and parts of the real put in place for us to begin to break these concepts down into these pieces and parts that we can digest. Like having a whole cow. We can't put the whole cow in our mouth, but we can make it into a steak, we can cut it up, and then we can take it in and digest it and make it functional for us. Does that help at all, or?
Yeah, just there's so many contradictions, like about like even still things are not still, and then we're talking about change being an illusion of motion. So it's like kind of a mind bender, I guess.
It is a mind bender, and again, like I said, it's not for us at this point in the book, right, to understand all these concepts. He's kind of feeding us the breadcrumbs along the way, repeating a lot of things. But in order to really understand this, we have to get into it's really a lot of inner work we have to do. And I'm sure that if we pick this book up in 10 years after we've done inner work and done other things and actually tried to live to some of the things that he's talking about here, this may become much more intuitive for us. But we are trying to unlearn years and years and years of programming and sensing and recordings. And I don't know where the recordings stop and the knowing starts, or vice versa. And the only way that it can is by us in discussion like this, beginning to unwind it, right? And beginning to try to fathom what he's saying, because it's not easy material. Even when I choose to put in the diagrams I choose to put into, oftentimes I don't, I only put kind of diagrams about what I think display exactly what he's saying in a very rudimentary way. But even by looking at some of those diagrams in that rudimentary way, may, like say a picture of the audience, may actually spur you to a new paradigm within your mind of seeing the senses as that way when you begin to have feelings or so on and so forth. And that may help you, further your understanding and knowledge of what Russell's trying to say. Any more comments? Okay. So, according to Russell, what is the definition of creation? And from page 79, two lights projected through each other to simulate motion, form, and change. So what are the two lights? The red light, red shift, blue shift, through each other to simulate motion, form, and change. I think I have a pretty good diagram of this somewhere here.
One where it breaks into like a rainbow, it comes in.
Right here? Okay, so, we have the magnetic white light. These are both magnetic white lights. But as you see them coming in, they do have different qualities, because see, this is more the blue, right? And this is more the red. So you have blue, violet, and you have red, then you have blue, then you have orange, and then you have green, and then you have yellow. So yellow is a centering point here, right? And from the blue side, you add blue to yellow to get green, and then the more blue you get blue. And then out here, what's in the spiritual side is you get the blue violet. And same thing with yellow, you add red, you get orange, and you get true red, then you get the spiritualness of the violet, and you get red violet. So as we have this is mind in motion. The gravity center of every ring is its center of mind control. So as you see, we come in here to the center, and then we come out with these colors, which then if you look straight down, so blue violet would be fluoride, and out here the white magnetic light, and I think this is what you were referring to, Doug, is the helium. So he has helium, not hydrogen, out here. So right here is being showed helium. And then we have lithium, barium, boron, and carbon in the center. So once we have carbon, we have creation, we have man, and the number of carbon is 666, 6 of each. Then we have nitrogen, and we have oxygen. So I don't even see hydrogen in here, so I don't know what happened to that. But within this,
I was talking about hydrogen for sure.
Yeah. So I see nitrogen. I don't see the hydrogen in here, but I do. I think hydrogen is made up of all things, but
this is within one scale,
one wave,
one wave of
yes,
of travel, right?
Correct.
And helium and some of the other elements that land on the crossing of the balance point.
It would be like, see here, see this wave?
Right. Yeah.
See how we have these fluoride, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, boron, so on.
So hydrogen, is it kind of at the same relationship to carbon, silicon? They're the
well, again, carbon's in the center, right? So when you get back to this
oh,
wave,
maybe I was reading it wrong. Yeah.
So here's carbon right in the center. So this is creation, right? We're carbon-based life forms, right? So this is creation because we're made of carbon, 666. And then that also then, as I talked about earlier, would go down into the soul, right? So the soul right here, right? So this is part of the music scale. So fa mi ra, right? This is sound of music, right? So both start. So helium is do, then re.
Can you go back to the octave diagram for a moment?
This one?
That one, yeah. So the balance points, I don't even know if that's the right way to say them. Say it. Are they the kind of outer extents, or are they at the crossing of that vertical line?
The crossing of this vertical. This vertical line is a 0 point, right? So this would be what we'd call the Christ consciousness, or the zero.
So helium, neon, argon, etc., are at balance points across at the Christ consciousness.
Correct, and this is the stillness that we've been talking about. So this is the stillness and the inflection points. And so within each of these cycles, so we talked about last week was that the definition of a cycle is actually from trough to apex, right? So this is not the cycle. This is the cycle over and above, right? And then this would be the cycle, right? So the cycle differs a bit between, so you would have red and blue on this side of the cycle, right? And then you'd have red and blue. So, blue would be in the ascending, side here to red, which would then hit the apex or crest, and then come down on the blue side, and then follow up with the red. So through here, he's showing each of these. I think these are actually the minerals. I mean, the metals, right? Here, and so each of these are part of what he would call the octaves. So you got the first, so all the way to the 9th octave. And as the octaves change, I believe the wave may change in intensity or density, and that's why you would start off with the gases and move to the minerals, and then maybe move to the metals because density is changing.
And everything ends up as carbon, if I remember correctly.
Well, everything is in the center. In the center is the carbon, right? As we showed here, everything in the center is carbon. It doesn't. I mean, but and see, this is like, I think when there was a discussion about Newton, was it Newton who saw the apple fall? And as the apple fall, that was only 1/2 of the wave.
Going back to nature.
And so that's kind of what happens here, right? We fall to the carbon and then we may go back, right? So, there's the two sides, and I think I have that on this other one too. Well, I think it's on this one here. Where is that one at? Right here. So when we look at this, so there is but one cosmic substance, right? And that's this mind that we just talked about. So this one substance appears to be divided into many substances known as the elements or matter. So as we see here that, we begin to, as this one mind comes out and begins to change into more of increasing energy and harder crystals appear and so on and so forth. So the one side is what he would call evolution, is the concentrative desire of mind. So the concentrative, we could also say, is the gravitational side of mind, which you'd say is the male side. And then we have the disillusion, which is the decentrative. So, this is what he would also call the radiation desire of the mind. And it wants to go back to source. So within this concentration, we're trying to create the idea of many substances. And then in the dissolution, we're trying to return that which it has created back into the source. So this evolution is what you would say leads to life. And then at a certain point, we begin to go back, and then we seek. Then this would be the death cycle or dissolution, and we go back to source, and then we come back into evolution and life again. So it's a constant wave that we're going through. Any comments on that? So I'll just reread the question one more
The
time.
concentrative is,
Go ahead.
the concentrative is typically considered the male
Correct.
sexed
Light. Correct.
light, and
It'd be this red light here of the male.
yeah, and the decentrative is the female, which I find so interesting, considering that, you know, life, like creation, comes from the woman, and men are often thought of as, you know, the destructive chaos agents. So but maybe those are just how all of us are. There's balance in everything, right?
And you know, and I mean, when you listen to mystics, sometimes they really will say that, you know, how there was female societies and then there's male societies, you know, or there was like these paternal and maternal, you know, different evolutions in man's history. And when we get into the male side, that's where we become very heavily thinking, right? So we're very male right now, right? We're very heavy into the thinking, into the concentration, right? And the women may not be relating to that as much, and they may not want to, you know, I wish we had some women here so they could chime in, but they might not be as concentrative as the men are, and they're kind of, you know, being more spiritual and having their, you know, female intuitions, living more in the spiritual world. And some of that has to do with the makeup, is that our bodies of men are just much more concentrated. Women, on the other hand, have much more water in their bodies and are much more fluid. So even though the act of creation takes place in women, it may be that the intent, or the male intent, or the red light, or whatever you want to say, is what actually concentrates that within that. Because from the moment we're born, we begin to die, right? I mean, that's just the way it happens. We do grow, we do get stronger, but we're actually in the deterioration process the whole time. Any more discussion on those aspects? All right. Let us look at, so what theory does Russell's description of creation and motion resemble? And I put down the theory of relativity. And again, I don't think that Einstein, we see here, right? Einstein, here's a picture of Einstein with the atom in his hand. So, you know, the theory of relativity, there are two main ideas that make up Einstein's theory. And this is a very, very simple explanation. The special theory of relativity. The principle of relativity, the laws of physics are the same for any inertial reference frame. The principle of the speed of light in a vacuum is the same for all observers, regardless of their relative motion or the motion of the source of light. And what does relative mean? The first principle listed above is pretty confusing. What does this mean? Well, before Albert Einstein, scientists thought that all motion occurred against a reference point called the ether. So Einstein is kind of the one who said that Einstein claimed that the ether did not exist. He said that all motion was relative. This meant that the measurement of motion depended on the relative velocity and position of the observer. So, you know, one of the things he would talk about, that there's a man in a train that's speeding along at, you know, 300 miles an hour. The man in the train sees stillness. You know, the cup on the table is still, his food is still, you know, his paper is not moving, he is not moving, it's stillness, because he is traveling at this speed and everything around him is traveling at this speed. Now you have a man on a hill outside that train, and he's looking at the train and he sees a train going 300 miles an hour, because in his reference plane, even though the world is spinning and the galaxy is spinning and everything, he is still. But he's seen another object that's traveling at 300 miles an hour, plus all the other motion that's within him. So some of it has to do with the relativity and the position of the observer. But at the same time, all light, no matter where it is, would travel at the speed of light. Now, I've read some things that say that the speed of light is not constant and that this because it changes. I think when you read a lot of Sheldrake, he'll get into that they actually calculated the speed of light over these years for when you do calculations, and it would change every year of what you would put in as a speed of light. That has now become standardized, but if you go back, what Sheldrake did, went back in the books and found that that was actually not constant.
He actually talks about something else that is the 186,000 miles, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Who, Sheldrake or what?
Oh,
Russell?
Russell.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about something else that's instant, and it certainly doesn't agree that the speed of light is 186,000 miles a second.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it didn't agree with Einstein also.
Yeah, he did not agree with Einstein.
Good.
But again, I'm just kind of talking about the theory of relativity in the sense of the observer and observing things and what the observer, because as we are moving, as things, we see the stillness, we think we're still, but we're not, so on and so forth. There's a lot more.
The other point, though, is that it's like the tree. If a tree falls in the forest, can anyone hear it? And obviously, the answer is no. Mm-hmm. And you understand finally. But isn't that the same? That's what he's saying, though. No.
What he's saying is that, yeah. What Russell's also saying, though, that he does believe in relativity. That it is to the observer that we are observing things, and we don't see the movement until we get out to a different perspective. So what he's trying to do for us is to actually move us out of the audience, right, out of all these things, and become more of the witness of the entire play, not just the play that we're in at the moment. That we actually see all things from a reference that's much larger. That we're seeing that all things are one. We're seeing that all things are in movement. We're seeing all of this, but yet still knowing that we're in the moment, but being able to understand that there's much more going on than what we're sensing at the moment. Any comments on that? On the theory of relativity, or anybody have any more to say about the theory of relativity? Okay. So our last question is going to wrap it up for today. And this is the $25,000 question. When does man gradually become aware of the two-way motion of all effect? Again, this is about become aware of the two-way motion of all effect. From page 79, when he unfolds from sensed man to spiritual man, when his full awareness of cause voids reliance upon sensation, he rises above his sensing and knows the universe of motion for what it is instead of what it seems to be. So this gets back to some of the questions we've had earlier, and that's why I didn't want to jump all the way here. But what Walter Russell is trying to get us to do, right, is change our relative observance of the universe from that of a sensing man to that of a spiritual man. That when his full awareness of cause, not effect, but of cause, voids reliance upon sensation, he rises above his sensing and knows the universe of motion for what it is instead of what it seems to be. And if we go back to my original diagram here, this one here. So as you see here, where I have this knowing mind of God, this magnetic mind, is cause, right? And then it goes through all these iterations to finally get to effect down here. So what Russell is saying is that when we can understand here in the knowing, in the cause, and become spiritual man, and he's not talking about, becoming a spirit, becoming a non-entity, not being of this earth. He's really talking about our consciousness, not our physical being or our bodies. But when our consciousness can actually become spiritual man, where we understand the cause, we will then see that the effect is an illusion. Any comments on that statement and Walter Russell's statement? Has anyone ever experienced cause rather than effect?
How would you?
Well, like I said, I've done it a few times when doing like ministry work or speaking to people, where I felt like I was being downloaded information. And it wasn't like me speaking. So it's like I didn't really have any sensation other than that I was just so in tune that I could actually almost observe myself talking. It was almost like I was outside my body. And I was observing myself speak, but I didn't know what I was saying really. But I mean, what I said was what was needed, but it really wasn't like I was trying to think about what I was saying. So I was not like behind my eyes anymore, but outside my body watching me. It was a much different experience.
That's what they plan to do to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Any more comments? We're going to wrap up early here. You got Grant or Jeremy, do you have anything to say before we wrap up?
No.
No? Okay.
Not anything specific. I have the same question as Doug. How?
Which is?
Well, this is kind of just thinking about your response, Will, and thinking about different kind of, I don't know whether it's out of body experiences or what, but just kind of different perceptive moments that I've had at different times in my life. There's like a, I was watching one of those after school videos today, that YouTube animation series that does little short segments on a lot of different interesting thinkers. They had one, oh gosh, who is it even on? But it was talking about, it's Sadhguru. And he was talking about the safety versus kind of this willingness to expand, and there's such a desire to expand. Sometimes when we go chasing after that too hard, it's like we stumble on the way. It's like I really want to find that path to understanding and knowing that cause, but it feels I have this awareness that that's not the way to find it.
What do you mean? What is not the way to find it?
The circus gang is coming down the stairs here in the background. It's interesting because Russell does talk about desire. I can't remember whether that was earlier in Spirit of Light or whether that was in the home study course. But the power of desire. But somehow I think like I misinterpret that word, and it's like a almost like a longing to expand. But it's too I don't know if greed isn't quite the right word, but it's like wanting something for the wrong reasons.
Well, we did cover desire probably about, I don't know, maybe 4 weeks ago.
Yeah, I haven't caught up on a lot of the videos.
And the way that he kind of defines desire is almost like the will, right? The will to know God. So we don't, when you desire things, when you desire outcomes, then you can actually get too much ego and you're no longer following within the knowing because you're trying to, trying to manifest an outcome that may not be in alignment with God's will or the knowing will or the source will. So that desire needs to be aligned with source if you want the outcome to be one that is from source. When we get in the way often, one, we actually may limit what we receive because we've cut off and not imagined big enough. And we actually are beginning to stop aligning ourselves with source. So one thing I posted here was kind of a thing I came across as I was looking for images, and it says full awareness of cause voids reliance upon sensation. And it says thinking is electric, knowing is magnetic, meditation is the key that will open the door to your inner self, wherein lies all the true power for material manifestation. For as sound springs from silence, so does positive action come from inner knowing. Be still and know. So within this, we see that there's thinking on both sides, the two pole sides of the positive. And within that, we have the stillness of knowing in the center.
I think that's kind of the key. Just stop trying to chase it with ego and just go back to the roots and sit with it.
Exactly. And that's kind of what I see within that stillness. And that's when I've gotten the best answers, or when I've really felt that I have been answered, is when I sit in the stillness and waited for the small voice, the still small voice, because it's hard to hear a still small voice when it's chaos around. Any additional comments?
Guess just thank you again for all the great material and leading through the discussion.
Well, hopefully it was beneficial. I mean, I try to find things that are pertinent. Sometimes it's not that easy, but trying to keep it simple too, and
Second that.
and enjoyable, All right, guys. So thank you very much. I am now going to stop the recording, and let me see here. Let me pull it up if I can, hopefully. So I'm stopping the recording now.